Hello, everyone, and welcome to our WealthChat Live series. My name is Lubna Bibi, and I am the host of the WealthChat Live series, as well as our WealthChat podcast. Thank you all for being here today. We greatly appreciate it. I encourage you all to use the comment section throughout to share your thoughts and also to ask questions. I will try to address your questions as we go through, but not to worry if we don't get to your questions throughout our discussion. We do have a Q&A at the end. And if we don't get to you there, we will reach out to you via LinkedIn to answer your questions. So we are going to speak about wealth trends in North America and some innovations that are taking place. And to speak about all of this, I have Brian Waladiva joining me. Brian, please introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me, Lubna. So my name is Brian. I'm from CGI. Among the many great things that we do at CGI, we're also leaders in wealth tech. And so with our Wealth 360 suite of solutions, we actually have over 2 trillion of assets being administered on those various solutions. And so my specific role is I'm the VP for our digital wealth platform and our financial wellness business. And so I like to think of us as helping firms by being a hyperscaler of personalization of investment management and financial wellness for their clients.
Amazing. Well, you're definitely the right person to be having this discussion with, given all of that. So today we are really going to speak about what I will call like 4 spheres, if you will. And so we're going to start off with the client side, and then we'll move on to advisors, firms, of course. And as we go through this discussion, I'm sure that there will be issues that are presented. So we, of course, need to round it off with solutions, because every problem requires a solution. So let's start with the client side. We all know that client expectations have evolved over the years, as is natural with human progression. And so what have you been seeing there? Like, for instance, there are more demands now. There are players outside of the industry that are setting expectations. What have you seen, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we get to work with a lot of different firms and advisors directly, and we run focus groups with those firms and advisors working with their end clients. And I think it goes back to even some of the nomenclature that we use, right? We use the term clients, but sometimes we forget that clients are also consumers, consumers of financial services, but also consumers in general. And so when we think about it that way, there are some interesting trends that you see relative to consumer expectations and how they apply specifically to the wealth industry. So I think a lot of what we're seeing as some of the shifts are, one, a result of changing just consumer dynamics. There's obviously that intergenerational transfer of wealth, which we know is happening. And, I talk to a lot of advisors out there that say, I have great relationships with my clients, but their children, not so much, right? And they ask, how can I engage with a different demographic and a different audience that way? And it's because different generations do have different consumer expectations about not just how they receive financial advice, but how they interact with the financial services altogether and what they expect from the financial services industry. So I think there's definitely a difference in expectation from clients and consumers of financial services. And part of it to do as well is they're just seeing differences in other industries, right? You talk about, healthcare is a great example, I think, to make the analogy to. We are developing this solution called the financial wellness that we bring to the market, and a big part of our ethos or our thought strategy around that is, when you put the patient at the center of healthcare, and you work for the patient's outcomes, they get better outcomes, and it's very much the same is true in financial services, and I think that's become an expectation for people and for clients and for consumers in general. Is that, it's not what can my advisor do for me? It's not what can a certain firm do for me? It's what are my goals? What are my objectives? What are my needs? And how can the financial services industry help me to achieve those goals? So I think there's certainly a change in expectation of how people are expecting to interact with advice and what they're expecting from it that's causing that shift.
Absolutely. And we've for instance spoken about the FANGs, particularly Amazons and Google, and how they just have all this information on you and they know exactly what you want. And so why would things be different? If Amazon's able to tell me, hey, I'm going to want X product in 2 weeks, why can't my advisor reach out to me and tell me what I need to do for my portfolio, or what I might be interested in, or what I may like. And just a reminder to our audience, this is live. And so please feel free to drop your comments, and also share some of the changing expectations that you've seen in your clients, or if you've noticed that you now, are very different, have a very different perception of your service providers based on what you did even 5 years ago. And we would love to hear from you.
For sure. You're definitely getting our unfiltered comments as part of this being a live broadcast. It's an interesting comparison, and I think there are both sides to the story on that one, right? So absolutely, you're right that consumers of things like the digital disruption we see in retail and social media definitely have an expectation in terms of digital engagement. And yes, they do expect things to be there natively digital and to be able to interact with that, especially as you look at, and I don't want to make this an age thing, actually you see this across different demographics. You see a general drive towards wanting more digital engagement. But we have to be careful to not fall into the trap to think that advice is going to become commoditized like that, right? So it isn't quite the case where I think we're expecting, advice is going to be surfaced as prompts directly to a consumer. There's a trusted relationship there with a professional. It's the same way that I absolutely get tidbits of information and I get guidance from my Fitbit from a healthcare perspective, but it's not going to replace me having a doctor or a team of healthcare providers that I work with, right? So I think it's upon the advice industry now to figure out how do we adapt to those changing expectations, leverage some of these great innovations where we're introducing ways to expedite and improve the engagement with customers and make it easier for advisors to work with those customers, but still really reinforce the value of that advisor trusted relationship.
Absolutely. And it goes back to advisors are not going away, because for instance, when the robo-advisors came out, there was a bit of panic. Oh no, what's going to happen to the advisory services? And guess what? They are still around, because I feel these new innovations that come out, they're enhancers, right? They help create a better experience,
sure.
But they're never going to replace actual advisors, because human beings value meaningful connections, and it's very difficult to have a connection with an algorithm. As great as it might be at predicting some of our behaviors, or anticipating some of our needs, we do need a person there who's able to listen, comprehend, and then give us feedback.
For sure. Look, I think what it's done is there's definitely a place for robo, and it's grown for sure in terms of market share. Nobody can deny that. I think what it's done, though, is definitely not replace advisors, to your point. What it's done is give an offering to an underserved market, and also gives the opportunity for advisors to think about, well, what do my clients really need? And there are definitely a mix of consumers and clients out there that are well served by robos, but there's many that aren't. And there's many that have a need for maybe part robo if they want. So I think it forces us into thinking about things not so fragmented in terms of, well, there's the mass affluent segment and there's the high net worth segment, and these are the tools for each one. It's more like there's a spectrum of client engagement and there's a spectrum of advice needs, and what is going to help the client the most for their particular situation at that point in time. And then when you think about it that way, okay, I can see the need for maybe a more self-serve engagement model, but I also see the need for advice. And so that's the thinking that I think the industry has sort of wrapped its head around is, it's not about point solutions, and disruption isn't about replacing advice from advisors. It's about realizing there's a spectrum of needs that change at different points in time.
Absolutely. And well, when we're speaking about having things like meaningful dialogues and delivering value, a big component of this is now financial wellness, because it goes beyond just the investment portfolio. So give me your thoughts on financial wellness and on what you're seeing and how you're seeing it being implemented right now.
For sure. The interesting, I think, proof point for that is when we talk about financial plans, right? And financial planning used to be something that only the elite had a long time ago. And understandably so. It used to be very expensive and time consuming to put together these very elaborate financial plans. And then what we saw was a lot of financial plans would end up being a document that served the purpose of maybe selling more product or maybe helping talk about the financial strategy for a client. But then it was a document that lived on a shelf, and then you'd revisit it, if you're lucky, a quarter later, but more likely a year later. And the shift we saw in the industry, and one of the reasons why we really wanted to put out a financial wellness solution, was the conversations that clients and consumers are expecting to have with the firms that they work with the advisors that they work with, is about their goals, their dreams. And the discussion became more about, how do I prioritize what I can afford to do and versus what I want to do, versus how my investments can support different kinds of dreams and goals for me. So, I'm not talking about just serving the mass market. I'm talking about even at sort of the high net worth. There's different prioritization of goals, wants, needs, and planning for shortfalls and eventualities that life throws everybody. And so when you think about it that way, and when you think about what you were hearing from consumers and of wealth and of advice, they're looking for somebody to help them with that journey, and they're looking for tools to help them with that journey, right? Again, same way that, I recently went on a fitness journey, as a lot of you on LinkedIn know. And part of that was me establishing goals for what I wanted, and my partner and I doing that together. And then, seeking out, how can we achieve those goals? So it wasn't about just getting a medical assessment from a healthcare perspective and then, moving forward. The same is true in advice, right? It's, what are your goals? What are your needs for your family, for your household, for whatever that means to you? And then how can advice help you along the way?
Right. That's great. And I feel that this is definitely a part of the puzzle piece of how do I engage with the younger demographics now. Because you mentioned earlier, all these advisors are saying, great relationship with my clients who've been with me for decades, but their kids not so much. And I think realizing that the younger generation is more interested in things like goal planning, where they don't really want to know what's going to happen 35 years from now when they retire. They're more focused on what's going to happen 5 years from now, right? Sure. Or perhaps even a year from now, because things change so quickly. And so to your point, I feel that that is a very important dialogue that can be had, in financial wellness and goal planning can definitely aid when it comes to advisors' journey and trying to connect with these younger demographics. Now, since we're on the topic advisors, let's speak about them.
Sure.
What is going on with advisors, and how are they trying to manage all of these influx of changes that we've been discussing here today?
It's a lot, and I have a lot of respect for professionals in the financial advice and financial services industry, because there is a lot of change, right? We used to call people brokers before, and financial services and advice used to be very transactional based, and it's not anymore, right? You have to be really involved with your customers, and really understand them, and give them that transparency, and give them that reassurance. And people's needs are changing, right? Stemming from the consumer conversation we were just having, from an advisor perspective, you used to be focused on sort of the traditional, let's create a retirement plan for you, and then when you get closer to retirement, then we'll plan your post-retirement. But life isn't linear like that anymore for a lot of people. And so advisors are having to adapt to, well, I guess it's a different conversation I'm going to have with my client now, right? Or with different parts of the family having different kinds of conversation. It's not just here's your portfolio, we're going to grow it, right? And I think maybe that's the misconception people have about advisors, is that, the advisor's job is to just grow the portfolio. And that's one part of the job. But really it's about securing the financial future for clients, right? And having them have security and comfort in that. And so that means a lot of different things. From a regulatory perspective now, we're also starting to mandate that, right? Because as you get more involved with your customer, you get more responsibility, right? We talk about going from initiating transactions to now, making informed investment decisions, which means now, I need to comply with KYC, KYP, and I need to be transparent about that in the reporting with, CRM3, lots of regulations helping push that. And it's not because that's just a regulatory driven mandate. It's because, well, that's the fair responsibility that comes with getting to know your client a lot more. So I think advisors are now having to adapt to, what are all the different solutions that are out there? that are different than just the individual products that I used to work with? What are all now the complex needs with all the different parts of the client household that I work with? And how do I marry the two together in really a way that is purpose fit for my clients?
Absolutely. I mean, that sounds like a very large undertaking.
Absolutely.
Trying to accomplish all of that. And for advisors, again, there's been advisors who have been in the business for a very long time, and they have a certain way of running their business.
Yeah.
And it is now time for some changes to be made. And you mentioned that there's different solutions now that also need to be introduced. And we actually have a question from the audience asking about direct indexing. So what are your thoughts about introducing direct indexing to meet some of these needs of, some people have very special situations
that
need to be addressed?
For sure. It's a great question. And it's funny because I talk about direct indexing with a few different folks. And, sometimes we think, oh, direct indexing is this brand new thing that's now arrived in the market and it's going to introduce a lot of change. We've had direct indexing actually for a little while, right? We just didn't call it direct indexing. And so let's break down, what that really means for a lot of the firms and the advisors that we talk to, and even clients that we talk to about that. And it is, yes, maybe following a more passive strategy of being linked to an index, but then you get some of the benefits that we saw in the SMA and UMA world where, I get to hold individual fractional shares linked to that index. So when we talk about direct indexing for those that are joining the stream, thank you for the question. That's kind of that concept there. Now, the question is, what do I think of how that's going to impact advice? I think kind of like the way we saw the introduction of robos, it's not going to replace large strategies. It's not going to make these large disruptive changes that I think maybe some people might. I think what we're seeing is people take a very rational approach to it, seeing, is there a place for direct indexing to solve specific needs for my clients, depending on what their situation is? And I think the answer is absolutely. There's definitely a place for direct indexing. When you look at some investors and what their profile is and what they're looking to invest in, ETFs make a lot of sense. But then how do you get the tax advantages of holding the different parts? Well, then direct indexing might give you an option there. And so to make it simple, some people might think, oh, well, that's just like taking a SMA model and applying it to an index and using fractional shares to make that possible. And to a certain extent, from a technical operational perspective, absolutely, it's possible to do that. And I think more firms are going to start to see that. But no, I don't think it's going to take over massive amounts of the investment area from what we're talking about with clients.
Absolutely. I feel it'll just be another piece of the puzzle for this, custom tailored portfolios
for sure.
that are being demanded. And again, rightly so, especially in the wealth management space, when you have higher net worth individuals that are in play, it can be very difficult to play, the tax situation and whatever else is going on. And so custom portfolios are essential. Absolutely. And direct indexing is definitely a part of that.
For sure. I think it's, to your point, when you talk about, as an advisor, tax strategies with your clients, it's hard to avoid the conversation around direct indexing depending on, the kind of investments you have in the portfolio. So definitely there's a place for it, but it doesn't mean it's a replacement for, doing a well-constructed, suitable portfolio for a client.
Definitely. Just another tool in the toolbox.
Absolutely.
Yes. So, I suppose we should also speak about, hyper-personalization, because that fits really well in here, and how advisors are trying to provide personalization for their client base, because we discussed that clients want very personalized experiences now. And so, what are advisors doing? How are they trying to meet some of those demands when it comes to personalization?
Yeah, for sure. I think the difficulty with answering that question is there's no, I don't go to a bank or my advisor, and no person goes to their advisor and say, I want a hyper-personalized investment strategy. Nobody says that, right?
Right.
People don't talk that way. But when we say hyper-personalization, it's because we see that in terms of what they're asking for and the kinds of engagement that clients and consumers are having with financial services. And their expectation is, well, how is this different than what you're proposing to somebody else, right? And so that is the expectation when we say hyper-personalization, is that, advice or investment solutions or any financial plan or financial advice for that matter is uniquely tailored to my situation. That's what hyper-personalization means, right? And so to achieve hyper-personalization, advisors have this very daunting task now of, I can't just look at my product shelf. I can't just look at the investment programs that I have access to. I have to look at everything. And I have to look at everything that my client is telling me and dig more to what they're not telling me, and then come up with a strategy that is specific to them. But then the challenge with that hyper-personalization, as we call it, is how do you do that consistently? How do you do that at scale, right? Because to sit down with every single client, probe them the way that I should be probing them, getting that information, putting together a needs assessment and a plan, then looking at, well, what mix of that, are you comfortable managing yourself? How much of that do you want me to manage? How much do you want to be advised on? What products should I use as part of that? How much of that should be in structured products? How much should be that direct, stock picks myself? Those are lots of questions to ask. And so hyper-personalization is bringing all of that together in a unique solution for a client, but then finding a way to make that scalable across your book.
Absolutely. And I feel like this is the perfect place for me to insert Gen AI.
Sure.
I know it's everywhere. Some people might be a bit tired of constantly hearing Gen AI, but it's very powerful, and it can definitely help with things like hyper-personalization and customization and delivering those memorable experiences.
Yeah, I don't think I could say that I work in wealth tech and have this be a wealth chat on LinkedIn and us not talk about AI or Gen AI specifically. So fair question. So I think maybe I'll start with a myth that I commonly hear, which is Gen AI is going to replace advisors and it's going to be, robo-advice 3.0 or 4.0, depending on what you see of the robo-advice industry. And I think that's a myth, to be perfectly honest. And I think a lot of the advisors and even clients that I talk to also see that as a myth. Where I think generative AI has some interesting use cases is in a couple of different ways. We talk about helping personalize the investments for the client, and we talk about as well helping a client understand the financial advice that we give them. There's lots of advisors out there that are extremely well-versed and well-trained and extremely good at managing investments and managing finances. But then they're often met with clients that don't share that same level of understanding. And so how do you explain the complexity of, I just went through all this product stuff and I went through all your needs and here's the solution. How am I going to speak to you in a way that you understand? So there's two parts, I think, for Gen AI. One is, putting that hyper-personalized solution together. And the other one is explaining it to your client and then explaining when things go well or don't go well, what that means, again, relative to their stuff. Because doing that requires a lot of time. So what does that all mean? So bringing it all together, I think way we're seeing that evolve in our Wealth 360 platform is this concept of, an advice co-pilot, which is not to replace the advisor, but instead give the advisor access to these intelligent agents. If I had a virtual tax specialist and a virtual regulatory specialist and a virtual investment, analyst, then I could chat with them about the customer's needs and come up with solutions to help me better relate that to the customer. And that's kind of a very cool way to introduce AI that can be trained on very specific subject matter that can help me then provide better advice to clients. So, we're really excited to be looking at that as one of the future use cases for Gen AI in advice.
Yep, that sounds amazing. Because as we've been speaking about today, there is so much happening in the industry, and advisors really need to become generalists now, where they have an idea of everything, and this can definitely help equip them with the right knowledge so that they can have those informative discussions with their clients, but also just as they're managing the households. Now, speaking of households, we do have a question on unified managed households, and where you see that future of the total family investment management area playing out?
Yeah, for sure. UMH. And it's funny because I've had this conversation just this week, and I had 3 different answers when I asked somebody or different people what UMH meant to them, right? For some, it's like, oh, well, we've had UMH for decades. It just means I can do a UMA across different accounts. Like, well, okay, that's one definition of unified managed households. But I think to get to the crux of the question, it's where is the evolution from an advice perspective, going from accounts to more looking at the household, or what some would rather call the total client relationship, right? Because household might imply some things very specific about certain family setups. And I think that is definitely the evolution. When you talk about hyper-personalization, again, it's not just about the person in front of you, that's your client. It's about everything that they bring with them. That could be their household, that could be their family, that could be all their relationships. And so when you come up with a hyper-personalized investment strategy or financial plan for a client, that has to, by nature and definition, include what are we going to do for the different people that are involved. And different people will have different risk tolerances and different needs. And what might be suitable in one place may not be suitable in the other. And so, yes, from an investment strategy perspective, it does mean I need to look at maximizing all the different account types from a tax perspective and all the different products that I have across the household. Various ways of doing that. Break apart all your models and put them into specific assets across tax optimized accounts in the household. One great evolutionary way to do that, something that we're very happy to launch on Wealth 360. Other ways of doing that are, let's just talk about how we marry goals to the financial instruments that we're using and the financial accounts that we're using, and find a way to map portions of accounts to different goals so that I can see the contribution of my investments to those goals for the household. So I think what I'm saying is UMH means a lot of different things to a lot of different people when we talk about implementing it. But at the end of the day, it goes back to what does it mean for your client, right? And they don't think in the terms unified managed household. They think in the terms of this is what me and my collective unit require as objectives and as our goals. And does the investment strategy and the tracking and management of those investments map to my needs from a household or from a family or from a client group perspective?
I couldn't agree more. And for those that are interested in UMH, Jamie Holland and I had a very LinkedIn interesting conversation around this topic. So please be sure to check out that WealthChat episode. Now, I suppose we can move on to the firm side, because we've spoken about clients, advisors, and now, of course, advisors are usually with firms, though we have seen a fair number of breakaway advisors coming out of the pandemic. But when it comes to firms, like, what are they doing and how are they ensuring that they are servicing their advisors so that the advisors can effectively service their clients?
Yeah, I think firms probably have it the hardest, right? Because we talked about the sort of change in dynamics and expectations from a consumer perspective. And we also talked about the change in the way that advisors work and the way that they approach their business. And firms have to cater to both audiences, right? Firms have a brand and have an identity that consumers relate to. Customer satisfaction is so incredibly important. We see like different rankings from the industry of firms and how they're rated from a customer experience perspective, and that weighs very heavily with clients. It also weighs heavily with advisors. And advisors also care about, yes, how well served their clients are going to be. They also care about how well they're going to be served by the firm that supports them, right? And I think advisors, as they get into that hyper-personalized approach, start to think of themselves as entrepreneurs, right? They're not just employees of a firm that are servicing the clients of the firm. They are entrepreneurs. They are professionals that have developed this business acumen and this talent for working with clients, that it makes sense that they see themselves as a practice. And so firms now have to look at both sides of the equation, both clients and advisors. And what was going to help both of those, right, is having a solid strategy around enabling that hyper-personalization at scale. That's, again, the fundamental problem with what we just talked about is scaling that. So I think firms have a lot of work to do, and this is where I'm proud to help firms do this, is focus on building that hyper scale for that personalized investment management.
Right, and it's interesting. We did our Voice of the Advisor survey. Yeah. And for those who are unfamiliar, our Voice of the Advisor, or VOA survey, is a biannual survey that we conduct here at CGI. Because as Brian mentioned, we do create products for firms and advisors to help service their clients. And we want to know how advisors feel, what they're thinking, what they're experiencing, and what their needs are, so that we can ultimately deliver that information to folks such as you, who are going to build some of these fantastic solutions to help them in their day-to-day. And what we saw in our VOA survey was that there is still like a very large array of types of businesses that are being run by advisors. Yep. So it's not that everyone is just suddenly, all fee-based or all, using unified managed account strategies or SMAs. There's a wide array. And so this kind of prompts the question of, how should firms be looking at this, knowing that they have advisors to service who are on this very broad spectrum? Yeah. What should they be investing in? And then also, should they try to kind of define their targeted advisors and who they feel they can service best?
Absolutely. Look, advisors are not a dime a dozen, right? There's different strategies that, because the client base is so diverse, it makes sense that the advisor base is so diverse. And so too is the strategies we can take from an investment perspective. You talked about some things like SMA, UMA on the discretionary side. There are lots of advisors that are licensed portfolio managers of their own right and constructing portfolios that they're managing with discretion for their clients. There's others that are putting together custom portfolios for their clients, but are working on an advisory basis. And there's some that are supporting clients that also have an execution-only business as well, right? And different advisors are in different parts of that spectrum because their clients are in different parts. Firms then have the daunting task of, how do I support all these advisors that have all these different ways of operating in business models from that perspective? So I think it goes back to your question, which is the firms that I see struggle the most are trying to be all things to all people, right? And it's very difficult to do that. It's not impossible, but it's definitely difficult, right? And it's especially difficult if you have siloed approaches from a product perspective, right? If you launch, this is our SMA platform or UMA platform, this is our trading platform, this is another tool for this kind of business, then you're intentionally fracturing what is not fractured from an advisor's perspective, right? Or what they don't want to be fractured from that perspective. So it goes back to, firms are also at different parts of their evolution. But I think it fundamentally starts with, what do you want to be? And what are the clients that you want to serve? And in turn, what are the kind of advisors that you want to serve those clients, right? Maybe you do want to really be a leader in, let's say, fee-based discretionary business. Great, be that. Or maybe you're no, we really want to service advisors that are, creating custom portfolios and managing that themselves, and we want to give them tools for that. Start somewhere. I'm not saying you have to pigeonhole yourself into one thing, but I'm saying be clear and intentional with the kinds of business models that you want to support and service for the advisor. And if you truly want to offer multiple ways of servicing that, then you need to walk the talk and provide tooling and provide platforms and actually provide an ecosystem for the advisor to actually execute on that.
Absolutely. Now, I feel we're going to have a very good discussion around solutioning.
Sure.
Because there's a lot to talk about there. But before we get to that,
sure.
There was a question around the intergenerational wealth transfer that's going to Gen Z and millennials. And the fact that this generation is very different than
sure.
the previous one, and they're very digitally engaged. So how can advisors, firms try to reach out to this segment via digital channels to support them, to engage with them, to make sure they're serviced appropriately?
For sure. And it's interesting because we also sometimes forget there's also an intergenerational transfer on the advisor side too, right? There's also a lot of books that are changing hands from people that are now retiring from the advice industry and handing it over. And so we're faced with both challenges at the same time. So how do advisors that aren't retiring, connect with this intergenerational transfer? And how do new up and coming advisors connect with established and legacy clients that are being handed to them? So I think it's actually a interesting issue in both perspectives. And so how are firms tackling it, or how are we helping firms tackle that? And I think it goes back, again, to being able to equip advisors with ways that they can have engagement with clients on their terms and also present solutions that matter to them. And the core of that means understanding your client better, right? So it would be probably inaccurate to assume that how you engage with your existing client, who's maybe in the boomer generation, is going to be the same as how you engage with, or even what they care about. So the first thing is to acknowledge there's a difference. The second thing is then to have the ability to have a conversation on their terms about what is important to them. That may mean transitioning from in-person, really elaborate meetings in a boardroom to coffee chats and virtual meetings where you're listening to their business plans and what they want to do. It's interesting because a lot of advisor-client relationships I hear about in that intergenerational transfer, they say that, I used to talk to my clients about how we're growing their portfolio and how we're going to leave a certain estate. And now I'm talking to their children about their business plans and what they want to do and the vacations that they want to take. Exactly. It's just a different conversation because people grow up with different expectations because finances are different. The world situation is different. So you need to be prepared to have a conversation about lifestyle. You need to be prepared to have tools that help relate their lifestyle and their needs and their goals to their investments. And you need digital channels to be able to do that if your clients want to meet you on digital channels.
Absolutely. Digital has become so important. And I actually had a really interesting discussion on our WealthChat podcast recently about building digital communities to connect with the younger generation, because they are on TikTok, they're on Instagram, and at some point, advisors and firms, even though in some instances they have been a bit resistant to going digital, it's not really something that we can avoid anymore. Like, you have to go digital. You have to meet them where they are, get an understanding of their lives so that you can support them appropriately and get an understanding of who they are. So I think that's great. Now, we do have another question around tax. So it's really a question around how can things like unified managed portfolios and households support some of the tax considerations. I have a feeling this is rising from some of the tax changes that are rattling around in Canada. But really just having everything in one place, how can that help?
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe to answer that question, we'll step back a little bit because I'd say that's a very specific question on unified managed portfolios from your perspective, like you said, and their impact on tax. And let's go to the fundamental question around tax considerations, right? Especially with the changing tax rules, especially around capital gains tax. It means that advisors can't just talk about performance, rates of return. They also have to take a look at what does that mean from a tax implication perspective. If you're going to offer hyper-personalized advice that talks about meeting goals, tax is a very relevant part of the conversation. UMPs, or unified managed products or portfolios, do have a way to, look at tax treatment across different assets for clients across their different accounts. That's one way of doing it. But to think that there's one product type or there's one, I'll say, program out there that's going to make it easier to do taxes, not true. Ultimately, it goes back to, do you understand the tax implications for the client? And have you communicated that? And do they understand the tax implications of the decisions that are being made? Yes, that may be a valid strategy. May not be the right strategy, may not even apply to them based on other areas that you have to look at relative to the client profile and their needs assessment and their risk assessment, right? So yes, it can work. No, it may not be the right strategy, but the important underlying thing to look at is what are we talking about relative to tax with a client? And am I prepared as an advisor, and is my firm preparing me as an advisor to have a qualified conversation about taxes with my client?
Absolutely. I think this is a great segue into solutioning.
Sure.
Because we've spoken so much about, client expectations and all pretty much advisors trying to just tread the waters at this point and meet all those demands. And then, of course, from the firm side as well, where they have, as you mentioned, a brand to uphold.
Yep.
So clients are, for instance, familiar with certain logos, and then also they have to meet the needs of their advisors too. So we can start off with platformization. I feel like that is a really good gateway into things like scalability that you mentioned.
Yes.
So tell me about platformization and on what you've seen and how, if you have any good case studies of where it's been done really well and it's helping.
Maybe I'll start with the opposite, which is where I've seen firms struggle with that. And guilty as charged too in other areas of business where, we sometimes cling to what is shiny and what looks really cool from a user experience perspective. And don't get me wrong, I will come back to user experience. It's an incredibly essential part of solutions. But sometimes people neglect, all the steps it takes to really delivering on a user experience that involve the hard work of integration and looking at the ecosystem that you're providing. I think there's a temptation out there to think, well, there's point solutions out there that speak specifically and perfectly to these single use cases, right? And people take a use case approach to it and they solve individual use cases, but then they forget that those use cases are part of a larger interacting ecosystem. And so what platformization is, and maybe that's how I can maybe answer the question, is taking a step back and looking at what is the full set of capabilities that we want to be able to offer across the business, not for this product or program silo, not for this specific use case, but what do we want to do in totality? And I think there's maybe a misconception that, I can just buy that off the shelf. If you could buy it off the shelf, that means your business is no different than any other business out there. And I think most advisors and I think most firms would agree that they are different than other firms out there. And so by definition, their platforms and their ecosystems should be different. And so what a platform is, because I've used that term 5 times now and I haven't even defined it. A platform really is the set of business capabilities, often enabled by technology, that you offer to both advisors and to clients and to everybody that supports them in the business. And that can include custody solutions, that can include trading solutions, that can include client experience solutions, that can include financial planning solutions, portfolio management. So many different parts or facets to that go into the platform that you build and that you offer your business to execute the business on.
Absolutely. And I mean, platformization has become essential.
Yep.
I've been calling it sort of the connective tissue.
Yeah.
So you have all these different applications and they're fed through the platformization. And so it's really the idea that advisors can have a single sign-on system where they go and they can access everything that they need to from that one point of contact, if you will, instead of having to open up 10 different tabs and go into 10 different programs, can do it from one. So when we speak about things like scalability, that would definitely assist.
For sure. I think that's definitely a big part of it, right? Is can I access everything all together? But I think maybe there's a part that people often forget, and then it's left to the operations team or the IT teams to try to solve this. Even something as simple as my client isn't talking to me about what account program they're in and whether I'm going to run a mutual fund wrap versus an SMA versus have a non-discretionary portfolio. You don't have that kind of conversation with the client. But we kind of force the advisor to think that way in terms of how they interact with the platform of the firm if we don't give them, what we call in Wealth 360 the unified account architecture, where, it doesn't matter what you're talking about from a product or account program perspective, it can all sit within one underlying architecture. And so if you start with, well, we have, as part of our platform, different point solutions for different products and services that we offer, then you're naturally going to create friction. Even if you solve the single sign-on, you're going to create friction in creating a solution that you can talk to your clients about, because I can't have them all in one account. So now I have to explain to my client why performance is split across 3 different accounts and aggregated at the household, even though they're all part of one investment strategy. So, when we talk about platformization, it's actually doing the hard work of how do I offer all these business offerings in a more unified way.
Absolutely. And that having things in a unified manner definitely helps save time, and everyone can be more efficient and spend their time on value building activities, because another big burden is definitely the administration portion.
For sure.
Right? And so there is too much time that's often spent on what are considered non-value activities. So platformization, and what are some other, I suppose, things or solutions that can be introduced to help advisors get some time back and spend it on the important things?
For sure. Again, go back to what we were saying before. Advisors have a lot to worry about, right? From trade decisioning through to client assessment and onboarding, through to suitability, through to learning all the products. So there's lots of things that we can provide if we step back and we think about what are all the things that the advisor has to do with a client. And so the best advice I have for firms and for teams as they get on board is, don't start with what your functional requirements are. Start with, what are the journeys that your advisors go through every day? And let's look at everybody that's involved. What are the operations folks doing as part of that? What is the client doing as part of that? And then you naturally start to identify, well, there's workflows that we can create as connective tissue, as you called it, in the platform. So something as simple, I'll give you a simple example. Client, comes to the advisor with, hey, I need to do a big purchase. Like, oh yeah, I knew about that as part of a financial plan. Executing on that is never that simple, because now I have to free up cash in your investments, and I have to then propose trades in a way that makes sense for that. And then I have to make sure that, the rebalancing doesn't kick in and undo everything that I just did, and make sure that the cash is reserved and then it's gone through, the transfer, and that they get it. Something as simple as a client asking for money is not actually that simple at the end of the day. And so that's a good example of platformization, user experience, and starting with the use cases of, okay, understand everything that's involved, and then find ways to automate that. And I'm not saying that, there's one solution that's going to fix all that. I'm saying you have to look at that entirely end to end, and then figure out how your platform is helping you do that in a streamlined way. So we can give advisors time back by focusing on those end-to-end journeys from a platform and ecosystem perspective.
Fantastic. Now, you have mentioned user experience a few times, and you've provided some excellent examples, but I want to dive a little bit more into it, because user experience, I feel it actually can even start with your team. In terms of looking at the advisor, what their day looks like, the things that they have to do, and then building tools that will actually help them save that time, and also be more intuitive in some of the technology that advisors have been given in the past. Because in some ways, it does feel like they didn't have as much of a voice in what they were given. And now that's starting to change. So, talk about some of the things that you and your team are doing, and overall what you've seen in terms of user experience.
For sure. I think there's a wider shift in the wealth tech and even just the tech industry altogether with how we come up with solutions. And before, it used to be very traditional, come up with the requirement, come up with your personas, come up with the requirements, functional requirements, then come up with a design, and then go and build it, right? And don't get me wrong, lots of great systems were built that way. But the way to look at rapidly putting out functionality in an agile way kind of necessitated for us a different way of thinking. And so now we've been shifting, and it's a journey that's in progress, to more human-centered design approaches. So it's not just about, because a lot of people say UX is UI design, or they think, oh, okay, UX, yeah, I use Figma. That's one aspect of being part of the sort of user experience. That's the UI design part, absolutely essential. But I think what it means for us realistically is when we're solving business and technology problems for platforms, for advisors, for clients, it means, again, understanding what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And then instead of jumping to, well, the functional requirements are X, Y, and Z, and these are the user stories that I need built. It's, what is the flow? What is the user's experience? And that's what we mean by user experience. What is their experience going to be interacting with the platform? And that doesn't mean interacting with software X. It means interacting across software XYZ, right? Then you sort of build these mock-ups of, okay, I think it's going to look like this. This is how we expect it to work. And then you test it. You break it, right? Is it going to work for an advisor that looks like this? Is it going to work for an associate who does this instead? Is it going to work for the other person on the team that does it this way, the associate? And then that's where you sort of do a lot of your brainstorming. Then you get to build, right? Mm-hmm. And that's when you start iterating on the build. But I think a lot of firms sometimes make the mistake of going, oh, I see the problem. Here's the requirements. I'm going to create a great UI design and build it.
Yeah, I am a big fan of this new approach, as someone who was in the industry, and I did experience some of the pain points. So I think this shift is fantastic and will help a lot of teams. I do sort of want to speak about what I'm referring to as like the app library that's being built now. And this is really the idea that solutions are being built in a modular fashion where you can take a piece of whatever you need. So if you need the tax piece, take the tax piece. If you need the portfolio management piece, you take that piece. And it just kind of allows advisors and firms to have an expanded horizon where they can go and sort of pick and choose what they like. And whenever I think about this, it always like reminds me of the Play Store or the Apple Store, where you can go in and you can pick what app you need for depending on whatever your requirements are.
For sure. And I think that's a theme you can trace through each one of the areas we talked about, right?
Yes.
Clients or consumers expecting, I just want to talk about this tax question I have. I don't want everything else. They want to pick and choose sometimes what they want to talk about. Advisors, same way. We talked about that with sort of the AI agents that we're looking at with the advisor copilot stuff, which is like, you know what, I just need to talk to an AI about this specific thing. Or, you know what, I just need a solution to help me with this specifically. And then in turn, firms also need then the capability of like, well, I have this platform that I'm building and offering. I need this capability to enable this business, right? And so the world, through all those lenses, is shifting to, not just can I buy a product, but can I buy solutions that augment my platform, and can I offer them in this play as you need or pay as you go or use as you use model, where the value that I get from the platform, needs to be configurable and needs to be customizable, so that I can vary how I use the platform.
Absolutely. And so before I let you leave today, because we are speaking about solutions and platforms, what are some of the exciting things that you and the team are working on?
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about financial wellness. We talked about the investment management side on the digital wealth platform. Really excited about how those two are being integrated together for us to, really democratize financial wellness across the industry. And then the next step of that evolution is, how do we pull in end customers into that story as part of the client engagement, and servicing that full spectrum. And now the latest and greatest, which is, how do we take this now use case-driven approach we talked about to augment with AI to streamline that. So, those are all the themes you'll see on our roadmap for Wealth 360 is, how do we take that user experience approach? How do we take the best of AI to, again, service that hyper personalization that we have in the industry?
Fantastic. And are there certain technologies that are being built that are exciting besides the Copilot? Like, are any expansions into different geographies?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the cool things that we're very excited about is different ways that the platform is starting to be leveraged in different geographies. Certainly, going very strong in our home territory of Canada. Seeing exciting movement into other geographies like the U.S. and having lots of conversations now with European firms as well on how can they leverage some of that best of breed thinking from a platform perspective and adapt it into their platform. So where they're not saying, you know what, I want the whole package, but we're saying, well, I understand you've got a need for being able to create that unified account architecture and do the sleeve-based portfolio accounting. Why don't we help you with that so you can build the right engine and the right platform to service your business model that you've defined. So very excited to see the componentization of the platform that way and expanding into new geographies.
Well, fantastic, Brian. This has been a very enlightening conversation. Thank you for joining me. I don't believe we have any more questions currently, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we can answer them after the live broadcast.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed it.